So let's focus on the four thinking components and what we can practically do to help a person that's having some hindering thoughts transfer them into something that's more helpful for them. Okay, so let's just do a quick recap. The four thinking components are the way that we talk to ourselves inside our head, the voices, right? In particularly the statements that we make, either about ourselves, others, or the situation we find ourselves in. And are those statements helpful or hindering? The second component is about not just the way we talk to ourselves, but this time it's the questions that we're asking ourselves. Are those questions the most helpful they could be, or are they hindering our progress? The third thinking component is our memories. When we recall the past, are we remembering helpful or hindering things? And finally, the flip side of that is when we imagine, particularly the future, are we focusing on what we want and is really helpful, or are we imagining failure or something that's going to hinder us? They're the four thinking components. So the first thing that we need to do is when we're coaching somebody is to actually spot the clues and identify them. So I'm going to introduce you to Natalie, and Natalie, I'm going to ask Natalie a few questions and we're going to see if we can get some examples out of this. So Nat, if you could think about a project that you've got on, okay, that you're happy to talk about, work related or non-work related, what would that subject be?
Follow up after a conference.
Follow up after a conference, okay. And is this a real live example that you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay, great. So what sort of timescales are we talking here?
Quite tight timescales. The conference finishes tomorrow, and then we have to follow up with all the people probably within a week, I would say.
Okay.
And there are 600 people at this conference.
Yeah. And what are your thoughts about doing that follow up?
My thoughts initially are 600 people in a week is a lot of people to follow up.
Okay. Now, notice what I did there with Natalie. I just said, what are your thoughts? When you ask a question like, what are you thinking about, or what are your thoughts about, people will reveal them. And Natalie used a statement. 600 people in a week is a lot of people to follow up. Okay. Now, the way that she said it wasn't overly hindering. 600 people, it's going to be terrible or anything like that. But there was an air of 600 people is a lot. So do you have a few hindering thoughts about that?
Yes.
Okay, what are the hindering thoughts you have?
The first hindering thought I think is, how are we going to follow these people up? A lot of phone calls during the day. Second hindering thought is, am I going to be doing it all by myself?
Okay, well, tell you what, just hold there. So notice that Natalie is now talking in questions, right? The first one is, how are we going to follow these up? Now that's a solution-focused question. It's helpful. Might even be more helpful if we've got the word possibly in there, or could. So how could I possibly follow these up in the most effective way? So as a coach, I've spotted that, and that could be a question that I give back to Natalie. Not for now, but I would probably say, well, how could you possibly follow 600 people up? The second question was about whether or not you'd have help. And I forget what you exactly said there, but it was more of a closed question. Am I going to get help?
Yeah, how am I going to do? Will I be doing this all by myself?
Will I be doing this all on my own? Now, that could be a helpful question, but it could be more helpful if we'd have said, who could you possibly involve now to help you? So, as it happens, I have a pad of paper here and a pencil. So let's do a real coaching session. Okay, there you go. Start thinking, who could possibly help you in doing the follow-up for these 600 people? And you keep writing, Natalie, and I'll just have a chat to the camera here. So what's really important when you're helping people with their thinking and you get into possibilities is always to have a pad and a pen or a pencil there. And I always encourage the other person to write, because if they're writing, they're A, using their own words, B, they can read it afterwards, and C, it allows me just to concentrate on the person. And when I'm looking at the person, I'm looking at their face and the pen. I'm looking at the speed and I'm looking at things now. As I'm talking, Natalie's probably listening to me at the same time, right? She's smiling, you see. But otherwise, people, they're not really consciously aware of what they're doing, whether they're smiling or they're looking upwards. And very often the eyes and the mouth just give you real clues about whether they're struggling for ideas or whether they're looking for inspiration. And I can see now, although I can't fully read it, Natalie's written down 6 things, okay, and she's paused. As a coach, that gives me the next clue. And very often the question is, well, who else? Who else could you possibly involve to help you in some way? Great, that's a win. So notice that I left the pause, I left the silence, and I was really convinced that my tone of voice, just going, who else, just possibly in some way, was quite encouraging, and there must be more people to do that. How many have you got there now?
11 individuals.
11 individuals, okay. Now, we could continue this coaching session and we could go down and say, well, let's get some priorities. Who would be the best bets? How could we persuade them? What possible ways are there to gain buy-in and all of that? But I want this little video segment to be about helpful and hindering thoughts. So I'm just going to ask Nat another question. You've done a bit of possibility thinking there now, Natalie. What are your thoughts thinking about the follow-up of these 600 people?
That it won't. There are more people that I can involve that would perhaps alleviate the burden off me, and there's more people to involve, which would make it easier to contact 600 people in a week.
Great. Notice that? Helpful statements. So as the coach helping a person with their thinking, my responsibility is not only to ask great questions, but to notice and flush out any hindering thoughts, turn those into a helpful question, and to invite the person to jot their ideas down. Now, thanks a bunch.